Horizon Forbidden West arrives just 5 years after the release of Horizon Zero Dawn, and it carries with it huge expectations. Guerrilla Games has built a reputation for pushing the visual envelope across prior generation PlayStation consoles, and Horizon 2 is its very first PlayStation 5 game. But this release is a little different. It's a cross-gen game launching on both PlayStation 5 and the prior generation PS4 systems. And we'll be exploring that comparison in our next video, but for now we wondered, would it live up to our tech-spectations? After spending countless hours exploring the many biomes in the game, however, I can report that our expectations have actually been exceeded, and Horizon 2 might stand as one of the most visually striking games we've seen thus far on the new generation of hardware. Thus today, in Digital Foundry tradition, I'd like to take you on a tour covering the visuals of Horizon 2, from the smallest details to the largest vistas, and more. There's a lot to take in. We'll also finally discuss the 2 performance options available on PS5, including the 60 frames per second performance mode, and discuss the many improvements Guerrilla has implemented over the original game. So join me as we make our way to the Forbidden West. With the arrival of Horizon 2 Forbidden West, Guerrilla Games has taken its second shot at building an open world game. You see, until Horizon Zero Dawn, the studio had focused on building cinematic, set-piece focused shooters in the Killzone franchise, so shifting to something like Horizon was a huge task. The original game then was well received, but there were rough edges, including somewhat fiddly traversal, poor facial animation in non-cinematic cutscenes, and rendering flaws in specific areas such as water. So in playing Horizon 2, I was relieved and encouraged to see that many of these faults had been either eliminated or vastly improved. Everything from its quest design and traversal to the world design itself feels more polished, refined, and engaging. It's clear they've learned a lot in the process. In some ways, thanks to its brisk pacing, it almost feels like an open world game designed for people that have grown weary of open world games, something I'll discuss at the end of this video. One of its key strengths lies in its varied locations. Perhaps more so than any other open world game in recent history, Horizon 2 features a wide range of biomes to explore, all beautifully connected to one another, and over the course of this video, we'll examine many of these. But before we dive deeply into the visuals themselves, let's start with some of the basics. Horizon 2 is expectedly powered by Guerrilla's own in-house Decima engine, and arrives in the wake of Kojima Productions' Death Stranding, also powered by Decima. There's a real sense that the experience they gained in assisting on that project can actually be observed in Horizon 2. It still feels like its own thing, but some of the quirks from the original game have been smoothed over. When playing Horizon 2 on a PlayStation 5 then, you're offered 2 choices, a resolution-focused mode, and another focused on performance. When using the quality mode, the frame rate is capped at 30 FPS, and the rendering resolution set to native 4K, with occasional traces of dynamic resolution scaling in very specific scenes. The performance mode, however, targets 1800p, also with DRS, but utilizes checkerboard rendering to get there. So they're rendering fewer pixels but doubling the frame rate to 60 frames per second, which means edge coverage quality is reduced, as you might expect. The thing is, usually the difference between 1800p and 2160p is minuscule, and ultimately it's easy to recommend those high frame rate options, but in this case it's not so clear cut. In fact, it's similar to last year's Forza Horizon 5, where the 30 FPS option winds up looking noticeably sharper as a result of the anti-aliasing used, and as a result, I'd recommend giving both a shot and seeing how you feel in this case. I ended up playing most of the game using the favor resolution mode as a result. Beyond the resolution, the favor resolution and favor performance modes basically offer the same visual quality with some minor differences. Primarily, things in screen space tend to be influenced by the lower resolution. This is most noticeable in reflections, but you also notice a loss in quality in the screen space shadows. Basically, when using the performance mode, you can expect distant details to lack the definition you get in the 4K mode, and the difference is a lot more pronounced than we typically see. It's not just about the pixel count here. So now that we've established the baseline image quality in the different modes, let's move on to our next section, where we'll discuss the world of Horizon 2. Let us begin by exploring Horizon 2's most striking feature, its vast world. The Forbidden West is packed full of variety and beauty both at the macro and micro level. Whether you're scaling one of its towering mountains, or scrounging around in its many ruins, the presentation is terrific. It really is a beautiful game. So when breaking down the game's visuals, I want to discuss both its large-scale vistas as well as its smaller details. And I'd like to begin by comparing certain elements in the Forbidden West with similar things from the original Horizon Zero Dawn. Now, Zero Dawn does still look pretty nice, I'd say, but there's an extra layer of depth and nuance in the sequel that elevates it. Let's begin by looking closely at the minutiae, specifically foliage and ground textures. Thanks to photo mode in both games, we can look closely at the actual assets. And as you can see, the ground textures are rather low resolution and the foliage itself doesn't hold up that well under close scrutiny, despite the fact that it looks pretty good during normal gameplay. Now let's do something similar with the Forbidden West. Here you can immediately see that the resolution of the base materials has been increased significantly. There's more detail visible at close range. Furthermore, the properties of the materials has been improved. It seems to behave more realistically within the world's lighting. For an open world game like this, it's kind of striking to see how well most of the assets hold up under such close scrutiny. This level of zoom usually isn't kind to such in-game details. Now, the same also holds true for other random textures and surfaces such as this, like this one here in the original is clearly pretty low resolution, whereas in the sequel, it's much sharper, as you might expect. It's one thing to look closely at things like vegetation, however, but it's another to actually interact with it. And in the original game, when walking across most of the world, the foliage fails to react to Aloy's movements. You'll clip right through it with zero animation outside of very specific plants, such as the tall grass you use to hide from enemies. In Horizon 2, however, Guerrilla Games seems to have taken these critiques to heart, and now pretty much all vegetation reacts to your movements. It's not necessarily always full touch bending, mind you, but at least everything now moves and reacts as you walk through it. Even more impressive, in certain instances, things like fields of grass can actually deform and change based on your movement. So if you trample through a field, you actually see the trail of destruction left in your wake, if you will. This even holds true for things like animals and other inhabitants in the world. Note how this raccoon leaves a trail behind him as he scurries away across this field. Impressive. In fact, surface interaction in general is one of the biggest areas of improvement in this game. Grass, snow, and sand now all move or deform based on your movement and the movement of other entities in the world. We first saw this in the expansion pack, The Frozen Wilds, but it's been expanded upon and improved this time. Both sand and snow deform realistically as Aloy passes through. If you run through it, you'll leave footprints in your wake, but shuffle slowly and you'll create a nice trail behind you. When combined with the subtle sparkle layer, which reacts to light, it all just feels wonderful. The only caveat here is if you watch closely, you'll see your tracks culled from view based on distance. So any tracks you leave behind are not persistent. Now, wind and weather also enhance these elements. The intensity of the wind varies at random, directly impacting the plants, trees, and other objects around you. It creates a very active, lively scene in motion. When the rain picks up though, everything whips around violently, while a wetness shader is blended into the material surfaces to give them the appropriate sheen. The weather also varies based on the biome you're currently exploring. As you make your way up a mountain, for instance, rain will turn to snow, while if you're caught out in the desert, you'll even encounter sandstorms. Speaking of environmental effects, however, I'd like to talk about water rendering now. You see, Horizon Zero Dawn looks fantastic overall, but one of the areas where it fell short is water. The issue is that most of the water in Zero Dawn just doesn't look very good. It's overly opaque, the screen space reflections are awkwardly clipped, and the underlying cube maps are both very low res and never really align with the scenery, leading to messy results like this. With Horizon 2, Guerrilla Games has clearly taken these complaints to heart and has completely revamped the rendering of water. First, let's start small, the streams. These turbulent tributaries start in the mountains and flow across the map into larger bodies of water. The streams use an undulating mesh with a surface that varies based on the surroundings. It's nice and calm in an area like this, for instance, but as it flows past rocks and other rough surfaces, an additional foam texture is layered on, which basically depicts the variation in turbulence based on terrain roughness. A nice touch. The designers also consider both the reflection and transmission of light here. The intensity, depth, and angle all influence what you're able to see below the surface, as well as the reflections across it. Things get a little more challenging when you reach larger bodies of water into which these streams flow, and Guerrilla's solution here is kind of clever. Firstly, screen space reflections have improved significantly, now reflecting more of the world deeper into the surface with increased precision, but it's the fallback texture that fascinates me more. Rather than using a fixed cube map like the original, Horizon 2 seems to update the underlying cube map based on world conditions, so it now properly reflects distant buildings, mountains, and even the sky. This primarily applies to more distant objects, as the handling of parallax on nearby structures would be rather difficult, and this is saved for the screen space reflections. The reason is due to the rate of update. Using photo mode, we can actually see how long it takes for the reflection to update. You can rapidly adjust the time of day, for instance, not something possible during normal gameplay, and you'll see that it takes time for the reflection texture to update to match the sky, for instance. What this means is that larger bodies of water now more accurately match the scenery around you, meaning off-screen reflections are now much more coherent, something sorely lacking in the original game. Beyond the reflections though, the surface texture of the water has improved and the ripples generated by Aloy now appear more realistic as well. It's simply a more attractive way to render bodies of water. Another thing, the appearance of water varies based on the surroundings, so areas like this rockier terrain display rough, more reflective pools of water, while those nestled around sand take on a different appearance entirely, complete with caustics, though this is just a texture, not actual simulated caustics, it should be noted. The sandy beaches are especially beautiful, as the depth of the water influences the color that you'll see from the surface. Increased depth creates deeper, darker shades of blue. And this brings us to the ocean rendering. Horizon 2 features a proper wave system now, which is crucial for this sort of environment. But what I really love about it is the way the foam forms along the surfaces as the waves crest. If you stop in and zoom on this texture, you can actually see that they're using what looks like parallax occlusion maps to create the effect. So in motion, it has this three-dimensional quality to it that looks really nice, I think. Moreover, Aloy can now dive beneath the surface of the water. Once you gain the breathing apparatus, you can swim around in sunken ruins, enabling some very atmospheric moments, in fact. Honestly, the underwater sequences are among my favorites in the game. It looks and feels surprisingly great, and even underwater plants react accordingly. So yeah, when it comes to water rendering, Horizon 2 makes great strides over the original. Moving on then, another key improvement I'd like to discuss is the lighting. So one of the big issues with the original game becomes evident when visiting areas filled with buildings. Essentially, indirect lighting was very coarse, and as a result, buildings and building interiors would often glow unrealistically like this. There was a sense that many areas simply lacked ambient shadowing, robbing the game of more subtle, realistic contrast. But this is a difficult problem to solve without something like ray-traced global illumination. But I do feel that Horizon 2 has made significant improvements here nonetheless. The first big change to Forbidden West involves the pre-calculated lighting. In the original, 6 times of day were baked for the entire world, and the game would interpolate between these. The sequel doubles the number of bakes to 12, increasing the overall fidelity as a result. This means areas like small alleys or passages around buildings now receive improved coverage as a result, which helps reduce the glowing building phenomenon we observed in the original game. In addition, probe density has been increased, leading to improved granularity and more subtle details being captured in the lighting. They've also added an extra bounce to the GI system, producing results a little closer to ground truth as a result. It's not precise enough to handle smaller objects, of course, so you won't get bounce lighting on them, but it does allow bounce across larger surfaces. In addition, the screen space ambient occlusion and shadows have been dramatically improved, adding additional contrast and depth to many scenes. These subtle shadows here, for instance, all done in screen space. It's surprisingly effective. Interior sections also feature unique render zones, allowing the designers to tweak the lighting and post-processing to create a specific mood within these spaces. Additional probes are utilized to help improve lighting fidelity as well, especially around things like doorways, I would imagine at least. Interestingly, this concept of render zones kind of applies to the weather as well. The rain, snow, and even cloud formations themselves are localized to specific regions now. And speaking of the sky, this too has received an overhaul with improved cloud formations and a higher resolution devoid of the artifacts you could observe in the original Horizon. That said, we spent a lot of time highlighting this feature in a previous Horizon video if you want to learn more. The cloud system in Horizon 2 is essentially an enhanced version of that. Suffice to say, the volumetric clouds are extremely important when it comes to creating these beautiful vistas. But this got me thinking about the depiction of large-scale environments in games in general. When you climb a mountain in Horizon 2, for instance, and gaze upon the vast wilderness below, the sense of scale and beauty impresses. But what specifically constitutes a beautiful vista in an open world game is this? Why does it look so good in some games, such as Horizon 2, but less impressive in certain other games like this? Well, it's more than just a difference in technology, I can assure you. There's a lot to this one. So to find out, let's climb to the top of one of the game's many peaks. On our way to the summit, you might notice that Horizon 2 features a more robust climbing system than the original game, making for a more pleasant traversal experience, a key improvement. Now, upon arriving at the top, we're presented with a remarkable panorama of the world below. Such a view can be broken up into several key components, I think. The horizon itself, including the clouds and the silhouette of distant mountains. The far-field detail, which is basically the content of said mountains. The mid-field detail, the stretch of land that connects the distant scenery with the player's position. And lastly, the near-field detail, which includes the terrain directly surrounding the player. Now, nailing this, I think, demands an understanding of how we perceive detail differently based on distance from our eyes. If you look closely at, say, a rocky or sandy surface, you'll spot plenty of fine detail due to your proximity to the surface. However, when viewed at a distance, your eye will not be able to pick up on such details, right? Instead, you begin to perceive a different pattern, a larger scale pattern emerges basically. The thing is, in a virtual world, the distance is the same between near and far objects for you as you're looking at a flat screen. So to achieve this effect within a game, it's up to the designers when building the world. This is one of the reasons why games like Pokemon here fall flat. You see these ground textures here, they're clearly tiled across the scene, both the normals and the color. They're presented to give appropriate detail up close, I suppose, but the scene does not account for the distance, and you end up with this unnatural repeating pattern. Such patterns are exactly what we want to avoid. Now, let's look at Horizon. Yes, there's a massive gulf in technology here, of course, but there's more to it than that. Let's look at the scene composition closely. The rocks near Aloy, for instance, they feature a large amount of texture and geometric detail, right? But it's not possible to retain this highest level of detail at a great distance. And that's actually okay, because this detail would be somewhat lost as it moves away from the camera anyways, and your eyes would instead pick up on other patterns, much like in real life. And this is where the technical artists can really show off. It's all about creating that natural difference between the way a surface looks up close versus how it appears at a distance, and they do take advantage of that here. But there's more. The use of various other visual techniques help tie everything together into a more natural landscape, devoid of those repeating unnatural patterns that we want to avoid. For instance, Horizon 2 leans heavily on volumetric effects and height fog to enhance the illusion of depth. Cloud and mist formations nestle in and around the hills at a distance, while the peaks of the mountains protrude from within, which helps to create a stronger contrast. A contrast which is then enhanced by shadows, for both near and far objects alike. You can see how, for instance, the plants at a distance are still exhibiting shadows. It feels generally pretty coherent, I think. You then factor in the volumetric cloud simulation, the lighting, and everything else really, and when done well, it all comes together to create a cohesive vista, and this is crucial to the presentation in Horizon. All these elements help create something that looks good both up close and from afar. What makes this all the more impressive, however, is the variety on display. Horizon 2 features a wide range of biomes to explore, from snow-capped mountains to thick jungles, wide-open deserts, redwood forests, and more. There's a real sense that each region within this world has its own unique look and feel. Now, I could go into further detail here, but by now you should have a pretty good idea of what Horizon 2 does well with its environment. The key here is that it's one of the most visually dense and detailed open worlds we've seen to date, and many of the key visual inconsistencies in the original game have been dramatically improved. It's a genuine step up that does take advantage of the new hardware, something that will become clear in our PS4 comparison video. But these environments only account for part of the presentation. The other side of that coin is the characters themselves. Horizon 2, like the original, is a narrative-driven game, and that means you'll spend a lot of time interacting with characters during your time playing. There are fundamentally two different types of sequences you'll encounter: main cutscenes used for key moments in the story, and the one-on-one dialogue sequences. The cutscenes are appropriately excellent, and more complex than anything found in the original Zero Dawn. The camera work, animation, and direction is all top tier. There are some small visual bugs though, which we'll touch on later, but by and large, I do think the game succeeds here. The original Horizon looked good during these main scenes as well, but I would argue that it fell flat when it came to actual dialogue sequences between characters. Basically, anytime you're interacting with someone in Zero Dawn, you get these stilted, back and forth shots that never really feel natural. This was honestly one of my biggest complaints with the original. The dead eyes, limited animation, and lack of expressions really drags down the immersion and contrasts strongly against the otherwise excellent main story sequences. This is one of Horizon 2's greatest improvements then. No matter the importance of the character, virtually the entire cast is now very expressive and enjoyable to engage with. They emote, they move their hands, and generally behave more like, well, an actual person. In fact, I suspect this time around, Guerrilla has opted for actual performance capture, which might help explain the leap in visual quality here. It's just another example of how the game has improved upon its prequel. Now, if you actually stop and look closely, you'll also discover that these characters are even more detailed than before, right down to a thin layer of fuzz on Aloy's face. Everything is rendered with meticulous detail. And as you'll see in the PS4 versus PS5 video we have in the works, the PlayStation 5 version has more detailed characters as well. Of course, during the preview phase of Horizon 2, one of the more talked about points relates to how the characters are lit, specifically the hero lighting as it's called. This is something we observed in the original gameplay demo last year and found it slightly distracting, as basically it looks like a floating invisible light source would follow Aloy around the gameplay scenes. In the final game, however, this has been toned down significantly during actual play, but additional lights are still present during the game's cutscenes. It's an interesting look that seems to have been designed to accentuate the characters during these sequences. It follows sound principles of lighting, at least when filming someone in real life, but in this case there's often no actual light source in the environment corresponding to it, and thus it stands out slightly. There is one nitpick with the cutscenes, however, and that relates to camera cuts. When the angle shifts, you'll often spot small visual glitches as a result of redrawing the scene. I actually had more to say on this because it was rather severe when I first started playing the game, but The day one patch arrived during the making of this video, and that seems to have dramatically improved these things. Beyond this, the patch actually improved certain scenes. Like, here's a shot from pre-patch using performance mode, and this is what it looks like after the patch. A significant improvement, I think. Camera cuts were often an issue in Horizon Zero Dawn though, so it's at least improved in the sequel, especially with the patch, but it's not quite as perfect as, say, Kojima Productions' Death Stranding, which also uses Decima. Still, overall, this aspect of the game is a triumph, and as we're starting to run short on time, perhaps we should jump into the next section focused on performance. When Forbidden West was first shown running on PlayStation 5, it was demonstrated at 30 frames per second. Knowing what we know now, I can understand why they wanted to focus on the resolution mode, but I know a lot of folks would prefer to play at 60 frames per second, even with a hit to image quality. So how does the performance mode fare? Well, let's be clear, the news is good. It does manage to deliver a mostly stable 60 frames per second throughout the run of play. Yes, there are blips here and there, but overall it's remarkably smooth most of the time. In fact, the one time I did run into an area with noticeable dips, I wasn't actually capturing and was not able to replicate the problem on a later attempt. Which means the usual open world caveat can apply here. You should expect stable performance in most circumstances, but know that it is possible to drop the frame rate on occasion. Still, by and large, they've been very successful in implementing the performance mode in this version of the game. It's the first time Guerrilla has shipped a brand new game with a proper, smooth 60 frames per second mode. And no, I don't count the unlocked frame rate in Shadowfall, as it only runs at 60 on a PS5. The quality mode then is much the same, delivering a stable 30 frames per second throughout with even frame pacing. Any dips or drops were limited to single frames here or there, but it was very, very stable. But there is a little more to talk about, specifically with the cutscenes. This ties directly into the issue I mentioned earlier, and the frame rate graph basically reveals what's going on there and why it can appear somewhat stuttery in motion. Those frame cuts produce both visual errors as well as actual pauses, as you can see on the frame time graph. In addition, during cutscenes specifically, we did actually note some GPU related drops when using the game's performance mode. Honestly though, as has become increasingly common this generation, frame rate analysis is really only useful to confirm that the developers have hit their target frame rates, and that's great news for the player, honestly. But the other aspect of performance I want to quickly mention are the loading times. Now, we'll get more into this during our comparison video against PlayStation 4, but long story short, it does exactly what you'd expect. Whether loading a save or using the fast travel system, the wait times are kept to a minimum. Having gone back to capture footage from the original Horizon Zero Dawn, I can't tell you how much of a difference this makes. The loading times in the original on a PS4 Pro are just so long. It makes you never want to use the fast travel system, honestly. Solving that makes a huge difference. Before we move into the wrap up, however, I did want to quickly discuss the occasional glitches I ran into. Some of these things were fixed in the day one patch already, so they won't be an issue for you, but other issues remain. Specifically in this area, I noted a problem with the ground cover system that results in a weird shifting and popping of elements as you walk around. It's clearly a bug of some sort rather than a technical decision, of course, but I wanted to flag it in case others run into it and wonder what the heck is going on. Thankfully, during normal gameplay, pop-in is usually not distracting on PS5. They of course do use an LOD system for distant objects, as most games do, and you'll notice things popping in here and there, but it's nothing like what I just highlighted. That said, the San Francisco area does seem to be the worst offender, and even in certain cases I noticed buildings that would remain somewhat low detail until you got close to them. So it's certainly not perfect, but considering the density of the world, I think they do a pretty good job managing this. With that, however, I feel like we've touched on most of what makes the visuals in Horizon Forbidden West so impressive. But as I mentioned earlier, we will have a PlayStation 4 versus 5 video coming up in the next couple days, if you're watching this on day one. And just so there's no concern, I can confirm that the PS4 version is actually quite good, with a stable frame rate and nice looking visuals, but the visuals are really interesting as the difference can be rather striking between the two. We'll get into that soon. As for the game itself though, I mentioned earlier that Forbidden West feels like an open world game made for people that don't love open world games these days. What I mean by this mostly ties into the pacing and the bespoke nature of its quests. Firstly, if you like, you can basically play the game like a story-driven linear action game. There's some light gating in terms of leveling, but by and large, you can basically cruise through the story without spending time doing side quests. But the world and the side quests are surprisingly engaging, and I did actually spend some time doing it. Honestly, it just lacks that tedium and checklist-like design of certain other open world games. You never feel as if the story is being artificially slowed down just to extend the length. Plus, traversal is actually a lot of fun in this game with the Breath of the Wild-like glider system as well as various mounts. Combine that with the amount of variety and it's actually a world you will want to explore. I really appreciate the things like the ruins that you can explore, which become almost like their own little platforming puzzle section in and of themselves. Even more surprising, at several points throughout the game, I thought I was coming up on the end of the game, or at least starting the final set of objectives, but then they turn everything on its head and you realize there's actually a lot more here. So yeah, there's some awesome sequences in this game. But alas, we've run out of time for this video. If you enjoyed this video, definitely give us a like, and also check out the Digital Foundry supporter program if you want to see a pristine version of this video without those YouTube compression artifacts. That's all from me for now though, thanks for watching.